Conor Wylie is a performer, writer, and director who creates experimental theater. He's part of a Vancouver interdisciplinary performance company called A Wake of Vultures. In addition, Conor was narrative designer on an award-winning video game by Sunset Visitor. As part of this year's Push International Performing Arts Festival, A Wake of Vultures will perform Seeing Double. It consists of two back-to-back shows. Both will be presented at the Scotiabank Dance Centre on February 1st and 2nd. Conor is the lead artist on K-Body and Mind, which he describes as a sci-fi odyssey. His collaborator, Nancy Tam, is the lead artist on Walking at Night by Myself. And I've done a different interview with Nancy Tam about her show, and I encourage you to look at that on the Pancouver site. Thanks for joining me, Conor.
Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Charlie.
Oh, my pleasure. Can you start by offering a quick synopsis of K-Body and Mind?
I can. So, K-Body and Mind is an experimental theater piece. The story of K-Body and Mind is of a security agent who, seeking to escape hunger and sickness and war, joins this collective called the Grove, who have created these new bioengineered and shareable bodies. So you basically transport your consciousness into these new bodies. And it's kind of a values-based collective. So that's the sort of plan to build a new society. But inside of that plan, their neural network gets invaded, colonized by this hostile entity called the Crying Woman. And so the story is Kawabi sort of fighting to understand what the Crying Woman is and try to save this new collective, new society that she has. And then I would have to sort of describe as well that it's a very unusual formal package. We've sort of blended this really like cyberpunk, like anime style, sort of like maximalist style with a super stripped down robotic minimalist performance style. So there's sort of a dissociation between the what you see and what you hear. You're hearing a kind of lush radio play happen, but you're seeing this minimal stilted choreography. And so in the act of viewing, in the act of experiencing, you're kind of creating the film itself in your own head. There's a very evocative, it's kind of old school theater technique done in a new way with some very Asian anime young person aesthetics thrown in. So I think it's a sort of fresh combination.
Well, I know I wouldn't want my neural network.
No, no one should. Yeah.
What was going through your mind when you started working on this show?
Great question. When I first started, it's been a long journey with this show. And a lot of my projects start this way. It's kind of like a very intuitive, what is, I just get these sort of hunches or these sort of suspicions that these very disparate things could kind of go together. And, I have been seeing, been sort of drawn to this sort of style of minimalism, very popular, like in the New York, like alternative scene, I would say. Richard Maxwell is one artist that I was really interested in. He's got a company called the New York City Players who play everything in this sort of like deadpan style, but with these kind of cinematic scripts. I think at the time too, I think it was Ravi Jain at Factory Theater had made a kind of like acclaimed version of Saltwater Moon, which was again like sort of taking this sort of Canadiana story and just really stripping it down to the characters and like a very simple stage with candles. And I got really interested in saying like, you know what, I think there's something to be done with that style, the evocation of the imagination that could get pushed to the absolute limit by telling a story like Ghost in the Shell or The Matrix with these like rooftop chases and cityscapes, this genre that we really understand and know from cinema that we could picture in our heads instantly, and yet which demands like huge budgets, huge imagination, and then just be able to try to like capture all that in this tiny theatrical form. I'm just interested in like the jumps in scale that the human imagination is capable of. And I think at the same time, there was sort of a cultural story inside of that I wanted to tell.
It's interesting because you may have answered my next question. What makes this show different from anything else anyone will ever see?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess I did answer that a little bit. I think like I do think it is like certainly I have influences for where the style um, came from. You know, as I said, Richard Maxwell. I think earlier than that, you can point to Robert Wilson, New York director, formalist director. Probably before that, you could point back to like Bertolt Brecht or something. So in this way, I'm kind of drawing these old techniques, but then with this fresh genre, I hadn't seen any of this kind of like anime storytelling on stage, and I actually often feel that like sci-fi on stage is very hard because generally sci-fi that we know from cinema or from novels before that, but we're used to big budgets, we're used to huge realizations with production values of these things, and so when you put them on stage sometimes it just feels cheap or it feels campy, or I wanted to create a kind of sophisticated version of this that played upon these ideas without having to use this huge budget. And then I hadn't seen this kind of like anime style voiceover thing or stories told on stage as well. I think there's just kind of a novel combination going here. And then I would say on top of that, as a devised practitioner, experimental, collaborative practitioner of theater, which very much I came of age and learned these techniques from other companies in town like Leaky Heaven, Performance Society, Radix Theater, Theater Replacement, where I'm an associate. Learn these techniques and then have this amazing pool of collaborators. Nancy Tam, who you've mentioned, Daniel O'Shea, the actors, and then we're just back in rehearsals. And we just had our choreographer Mihaela Patterson O'Brien come back in, and she has a very distinct sort of patterned, you know, sort of what I would say, at least in how we're using it, a very robotic choreography style. And so it was just like really, it's like using all the aesthetics and tools that we have here amongst our pool of collaborators, and that who came of age and are practicing in Vancouver. It's very much a Vancouver aesthetic, also.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think the
Yeah.
public fully appreciates how Vancouver is really on the vanguard of experimental theater in a lot of ways. And
Experimental theater, experimental sound and dance, and all these practices,
yeah,
yes, that very much grew up
absolutely.
here and intermingle here. That yeah, I think aren't always witnessed or seen here, but do get recognition,
Yeah, internationally.
across the country, internationally, exactly. So yeah.
And 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 as far as science fiction as a storytelling device,
hmm
I'm curious to know, what is it about science fiction that appeals to you as a creator of theater?
Great question, Charlie. One that I think I've wrestled with a few times because coming out of theater school, or like, growing up, I don't know that I thought I was going to make science fiction. And then at a certain point I started to make it, and now it's almost entirely what I make. It really is like an intuitive thing. I think it comes from like partly a, a childhood impulse of world building, of just an interest in world building and role play. Like I think back to being a kid at elementary school, and while everyone's playing on the soccer field or like running through the stream or whatever, I had my two buddies, and we would just like slowly walk over the school grounds and role play that we were in Transformers or X-Men or something like that, like just conjuring these worlds ourselves. So I think that that's just like, it just comes from a sense of childhood play. um but then the longer that I've spent in the genre, um the more I become actually interested in the possibility of reimagining society, whether that's on like in K Body and Mind, that's kind of like there's a city that I've imagined and a future world that I've imagined, but then inside of that city there's also like this collective, the Grove, that has a kind of utopian ideal. So that's kind of about collectivism, cooperatives in a way, building community, just ways to, and then inside of that too, family is a thing that comes up all the time in these sci-fi narratives for me. So it's just like another lens to
Hmm.
to sort of show. And I think, it's like I have an interest in like showing people's capacity to change and to imagine alternatives for ourselves so that we don't get trapped
Hmm.
in in harmful cycles, so that I think that's one of the things that motivates my continued exploration of the genre. Yeah.
And one of your earlier works, which wasn't science fiction, was Eating the Game, uh,
Sure. Yeah. Many years ago. Yeah.
many years ago, but it addressed your background as a person with Chinese and European heritage. And I'm curious what to know what you were trying to do with this work, Connor.
Yeah. Oh man, that's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm happy you brought it up. That's a long time ago. Um, uh,
Yeah,
I
it's
think
almost
at
a
the
decade ago.
yeah, yes, totally. Yeah. Oh boy. It's that was a satire. I would say that that was actually one of the early sci-fi or speculative works. That was like imagining um a version of myself that quit the theater and got into like venture capitalism overseas, and like that, that came from an impulse from Milton Lim, the lead, he
From
was
Hong
a
Kong
project lead
Exile.
on that. Yeah, from Hong Kong Exile. It was a Hong Kong Exile project. And he had somehow, he's such a, sweet and generous and curious soul, but he had, after one presentation, been kind of like roped into, or led into a kind of like pyramid scheme situation, a meeting. He didn't join the pyramid scheme, but like, he was like, this is a pyramid scheme. And the kind of speaker there was talking in a kind of disgusting way about like, about, Asia as the like gateway to commerce and finance. If you want to get rich, this is where to the Asian marketplace is what you have to tap into, And so the kind of like icky feeling around exoticism
Hmm.
that he experienced there was like, we got to exercise that, in a show in some way. So it was like a kind of like, I don't, it's very much a period of its time, because like, I think also we were just fresh out of school. We were a bit like feeling rock and roll about things, feeling a little edgy. And, that was a satire, but it was also this sort of speculative thing, but it was like very tongue in cheek, very, intentionally irreverent, insincere, a bit of trickery in it, like there was a game inside of it in the second, like it was like 25 minutes of this like sort of lampooning of the like travel back to the motherland
Hmm.
story, and then the show abruptly ends after 25 minutes, and then we come back and do a talk back, um, and we like, talk about the creation of the show and all the stuff that got cut, and then it becomes apparent that like, oh, this is a ruse for like, part of this journey. The journey is ongoing. You're still in the pitch, but like we played a game inside of it called um, White or Asian, where I would just like call out things, and the audience would call back whether that thing was white or it was Asian, which is like very, tied in a very crass way to my identity, but
Yeah.
quite like, it
So
was a satire. Yeah.
the timing of it coincided with really the snowballing of the anti-Asian mindset that permeated Vancouver for a while. It was,
Mm.
linked to real estate and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
money and all of that, which,
For sure. Yeah.
and in some ways, some false assumptions about what was really going on,
Hmm.
and a
Hmm.
misunderstanding of people and conflation of a bunch of things. And
For
so I'm
sure. And I
wondering
think,
like how
yeah,
much of this was underlying what you were doing.
absolutely it was. I mean, also, a lot of the research at the time was around like, um, attitudes around empty homes that
Hmm.
were, purchased by, yeah, I guess at the time it was like, said to be primarily overseas Chinese buyers,
Hmm.
contributing to the sort of housing crisis in Vancouver. Um, and so, yes, I think we were like, it was kind of like, okay, let's go in there, like let's go into that fear, let's go into it, but then let's complicate your feeling about that. Like if you really think like, it's like, hey, this is happening. And you're like, hey, wait a minute, is your racism actually
Hmm.
about, specific things that are happening, or is it an excuse for you to like paint overall this in a, with the big brush? Um, I would say between then and now, we had a very kind of like cavalier attitude. This is actually like our first presentation at Push, which is kind of cool that, we're coming a little full circle here. But like then I think it was kind of like um fueled by some also like oh my God, now I'm at this festival that I adore, and we're gonna be edgy about it, and we're gonna poke fun at everybody, and and we ourselves we're really coming at it like full force. And I think now, I mean, I've kind of like left satire behind, but I try to be much more targeted and specific about my intentions inside of my art than we did in that period of time,
And,
Yeah.
and another one you did with Hong Kong Exile was
Hmm.
Far Away to the State Machine. Um, how important was this in your development as an artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was actually like a moment where we really put the sci-fi hat on full force
Mhm.
for the first time. And I was just thinking about that show earlier today because I was, reflecting that like so I'm mixed, right?
Yeah,
My dad's side is sort of like European settlers, and then my mom's side is Chinese. And was reflecting that I've never been, as I'm an actor too, I've never been cast in a role as Chinese. Um, I've only ever played Chinese roles or roles that reflect my identity when I've written them myself,
interesting.
created them myself. And I that has a lot to do with how I look. It's like in theater, it's like theater, there's a more leeway, I think, um for people like, I am Chinese, so if I were to play a role on stage that was Chinese, I think people would accept it. Like film and TV and commercials, like cannot accept that I'm Chinese. Like they can't see it, right? Like, or they're like accept it, but they're like, we're not going to cast you as that because you don't look like that. Like they want to bring me out for Latino role or something like that, which I absolutely will not do. So anyway, I was thinking back to visitors about uh, that time where I was like, oh yeah, that's actually like, I get to play a version of myself in that again too, right? Mixed race, mixed background. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that was the first time that we went like deep into science fiction and role play. I think um uh what do I want to like again, like feels like a different era for me in terms of
Yeah.
um, you know, we made big like big plays, and I just try to be a bit more targeted now. But um, um, we had a lot of fun doing that show. I don't know, and it was also like an intro to like I think it was felt like a step forward for the like um, kind of projection and new media work that was happening at that
Have,
company, and
have,
that kind of permeated our community. Yeah.
have you ever explored your family history on your Chinese side, Connor?
Um, yeah, yeah.
And do you know like which is your mom like is her are her roots family roots in Hong Kong or is it another part of China or anywhere else in the
Yeah,
world?
so I mean, so I'm third generation,
Yeah.
almost like kind of like almost fourth because my great grandfather was here, but then my grandfather and grandmother immigrated from China. They're from a village called Hochang Village
Mhm.
in South China, Guangdong province, which is just like really now was rural, right? Was a little village in the
Mhm.
countryside, and is now, was swallowed up by Guangzhou
Yeah.
in its expansion. So now is part of the Pearl River megacity and doesn't exist in the way that it did. But yeah, we're from South China, Cantonese speaking family, and then yeah, my grandparents, you know, my grandfather joined his father, who had immigrated to Victoria, and so we have, the family lineage
So
goes
was
to
the family
Victoria.
then affected by the exclusion legislation then? Like did
That's a piece of family history that I have not really delved
yeah.
into. Yeah, yeah,
Because Victoria was is basically the oldest Chinese community in BC and pretty much
yeah.
like people would go
And
through Victoria on their way. But and as far as do you
mhm.
speak Cantonese?
I don't speak
Oh,
Cantonese,
okay.
no. Like my cousins, like so our generation, some speak a little bit because they grew up in the household with my grandparents. But for me, as a mixed person, my dad was white. We spoke English in the household, so I really didn't pick it up. But I did grow up with like, I'm very close with my grandmother still, and um, and we grew up like having family dinners every weekend, and with beautiful banquet that they had made for us, my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, and big family banquets at Cantonese restaurants. So I definitely grew up feeling like that was a
That's
big
part
part
of
of
the
my
culture
culture.
of
I
eating.
grew up
Yeah.
feeling that I was Chinese, even if people didn't see it at my school or whatever, right? Or like at at school, I would be like, it's always felt like a bit of a superpower to just be able to like, okay, I can go hang out with my diverse drama club friends or whatever, or I can go to the cafeteria and I can play cards with like all the Chinese guys there,
Mhm.
and just like feel like I belong in whatever place I I am in at any given time. So, um, but yeah, I grew up feeling Chinese for sure and being very close to my grandparents and my mom's
And
generation. Yeah.
and have you thought about how your kind of Chinese ancestry might inform your art, even whether it's subconsciously or consciously?
Lots of ways. There's so many ways. I have found, I think, in the last few years, I've certainly written family stories at the heart of even, K Body and Mind, for all the like wild sci-fi that I've just spoken about, is at its heart a family story. And it's kind of a story about immigration too, right? It's about um, people trying to make a life in a new land. In this case, they have brand new bodies, but like it's also sort of intended to, in some ways, mirror what our grandparents, great grandparents came to Canada to do, right? To build a better life for themselves and for their future generations. And to, so, I feel um, sometimes those permeate in a conscious way. And sometimes I'm sure it's just a very unconscious way that it just reflects where I come from and where I am now, and the privilege that I have to envision versions of the future that are tied to the intentions and goals that my grandparents, and the gratitude I feel for the difficult journey and life that they and then our parents' generation have gone through to allow me to be able to do what I do now. I don't the life that I lead,
You've,
not something that they could even imagine. Yeah.
yeah, and you've worked with artists of, first generation, second generation
Yeah.
Chinese ancestry. Uh, What have you learned working with, people like Jasmine or Jasmine Chen, who's in the show, or Nancy Tam, who does the music,
Yeah.
and a longtime collaborator of yours with with your collective?
So there's been so many interesting conversations over the years, and
And Five
sometimes like,
Blessings Collective too. You were with them too, where
yeah, I help them. I mean, I've
you
voiced some stuff with them, but I also help them build their website. But yeah, I mean, that's very much my community for sure. Um, I think like we often, um, we talk about our families. We talk about more specifics in this way generally, or um, uh, family dynamics or histories a bit. Like I think we're also bound by like this desire to um, allow our culture and our history to permeate our work, permeates our aesthetics, permeates the stories that we tell, but we don't ourselves feel beholden to have to talk about them or, perform them at all times.
show
It's
rather
like,
than tell. Like,
yeah, or just like be,
yeah, and B,
rather,
well, a good
yeah.
example is A Thousand Times Resist, a video game you
Mm-hmm,
did with Sunset Visitor and
mm-hmm,
Ray
mm-hmm.
Sue. Um, what was it about that project that appealed to you?
Yeah, I think like, um, uh, I mean, that was a long time collaboration, between because Remy and Natalie both come from Hong Kong exile, right?
Yeah,
That's their collaboration. So we had been working for many years, and we had already started to explore video games. So I think it felt like a natural extension of the collaboration we were already doing, and some of those sci-fi ideas had previously explored in some other projects that that kind of morphed or transformed into this one. I think there's so much, there's, I mean, there's so much. And like that just honestly just feels like a pool that I swim in all the time, you know? I will say that there's like, I'm glad that this came up too, because, and I want to tie it in with the sort of talking of people of different generations, you know, but that was like, I was like, ah, very, very pointed moments in that conversation where, you know, Remy and Natalie are both second gen, and I'm third gen, you know, and I remember at one point, um, I think we have like you know, we encountered where there had maybe just been assumptions that our lives had been similar. There was actually real pointed differences because of our generational the divide between us, you know. That like, you know, they were I was like, there was one moment where I was like, what if this character from the past or whatever, right? Like this mother character or something, like came back, encountered the family and like apologized, and there was like some kind of like intergenerational reconciliation that happened or something, you know. And they both looked at me like, are you crazy? That would never happen,
Would
you know?
never
Like that
happen.
way, there's no way this person is ever gonna apologize in their life, you know? Like there was like a clear generational thing that they had seen, you know, that ended up becoming, you know, I think with like Natalie and I, like a very fruitful conversation, like, you know, over many, you know, iterations now, we've reconnected over that point of like, that I, you know, I as someone further on, or not further on, like just with a different generational experience, like have seen that like, oh, you know, like no, like my, you know, my cousins, for example, right, are like they're building their own lives in their very own intentional way, you know, like that, and that like I've seen my family transform like from a family that doesn't hug to a family that does hug, that is very affectionate and open and loving and says I love you, and you know, like actually these sort of things can transform over time, and I really believe in that, you know. And it was just a thing that like Remy and Natalie was just like that just seems impossible, you know. So the notion that like it was like sort of, and then that became aesthetic choices about like, does the cycle just repeat, right? Does one generation pass on their trauma to the next generation? Does the generation just repeat exactly the same trauma to the next generation, you know? um Whereas I always kind of want to come to a place of like, well, but where along the way does it, can it transform, you know? So there was some sort of like interesting creative friction around those conversations, that found their way into that process. Yeah.
And another thing, Connor, because you're in the arts,
Mm,
the we have a huge population in Canada of people of Chinese ancestry, and Cantonese has been a language of Canada, you know, since the 19th century, even earlier,
yeah.
if you go back.
Hmm.
And at the same time, in our kind of mainstream media, film, and particularly, you know, TV, uh, it hasn't been as present traditionally in let's say in proportion to the population or the contributions to the country.
Mm, mm.
And it makes me wonder how you felt as a kid growing up, seeing your European kind of heritage reflected all the time, every time you turned
Mm.
on the
Mm,
TV or
mm,
went to
mm.
the movies, but not so much your Chinese side.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, um, thinking, yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure. Like, first I'll go back to like being a kid and watching cartoons or something. You know, I'm being like, well, that's animals. You know, I'm like, it's like I can't. You know, I'm not noticing. You know, race or you know how culture is coded into these, you know, into like Animaniacs or something. You know, or um, uh, I don't know that I necessarily like.
Like, did a show like, well, you were adult by this time, but I'm, yeah, you had Margaret Cho in the early 1990s did a show for one season,
Mm,
and then it
mm,
took 20 years before Fresh Off the Boat came.
mm, 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 mm.
And that's a long period, long drought.
Right, 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 right. On North American television. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're growing up. Um,
Right.
but maybe you did, you know, you're a kid, you're just growing up, you're living your life. You don't think about these things, but
You know, I don't know that I necessarily like felt acutely the lack of representation,
mhm.
but when I saw people that I was like, that is person is like me, of course that made an imprint, you know, like seeing Keanu Reeves on TV or something, you know, or like being drawn to, you know, as a young adult, like late night, seeing Hard Boiled on TV with Chow Yun Fat, you know, and being like at the John Woo film, right, and being like, oh my god, like this is like all these amazing action films, but it's like, and it's got Chow Yun Fat, and you know, like, um, uh, so I was drawn to, those like Cantonese films, Hong Kong films, Jackie Chan too, you know, like, um, think back to like, I don't know how it holds up, but like Shanghai Noon or something like that, you know, that seeing, I remember Crouching Tiger, you know, that was a
Yeah.
massive film, you know, a very important film. So I don't know that I always felt the lack, but I definitely was like, when I saw this Chinese representation, I was like, oh, that's my team. I'm here for it, you know, like, but also as a kid, like, and it ties back into K Body and Mind, like, um, not Chinese, right? But like being drawn to like anime stories on television, right? Japanese stories, what felt like Asian stories, or like that was also like just as a kid, kind of outsider stories, you know, being like, I like, it's not my show, but I'm like, I always leave the TV on when Sailor Moon is on or something, you know, being interested by that representation and not totally understanding it, but being drawn to it, you know, um, stories, not just um, from Hong Kong, China, um, uh, but also Japan. And maybe that was like also just like bonding with other Asian kids, POC kids, outsider kids, you know, that those made an imprint in a way. The weird English dubs of anime um,
Yeah.
have found their way into K Body and Mind in a strange way, you know? So, yeah.
Well, this is great. I'll ask you one final question.
Sure.
Where do you see your career going from here?
Great. What a great question. Like, it's, actually, maybe I'll get real about like how tough a time it is in the arts right now. I've been very privileged to be able to work professionally for over 10 years and, make my living doing this. Um, Funding is very uncertain right now, right? We're living, I think it's like both a hard time in the arts and just a hard time economically for everybody that lives on these lands, and around the world. So, it's like, eh, I'm speaking from a place of both where my career, because of funding situations and projects drying up, like feels very uncertain. But I also feel very liberated to explore whatever story I want to right now, So I very much in the next 10 years desire to continue to grow um, my personal practice, my practice with A Wake of Vultures, Who Makes Seeing Double. Um, um, I theater replacement with my my close collaborators, and then I also have a desire to kind of like maybe reach further and write for television or write for TV, where I think sci-fi often feels like it's more at home, right? And there's more of an audience around the world for it, than making very experimental sci-fi theater for a small audience in Vancouver. So I have a pilot episode of a TV show that I'm kind of workshopping right now. I'm starting a new theater project, with Playwrights Theater Center. So yeah, I see myself continuing to write and sort of expand mediums and just continue to see where the
Yeah.
sci-fi storytelling can take me. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic, Connor. Thank you for speaking to me and sharing your story. I learned a lot.
That's great, Charlie. Thanks. I think I learned a lot just from your questioning and getting to explore those things. So I really appreciate it.
Okay, Conor Wylie is the lead artist on K Body and Mind. It's part of the Seeing Double performances with Walking at Night by Myself. It's at Scotiabank Dance Center on February 1st and 2nd as part of the Push Festival. Now I have to stop it here, Connor, and I've got to open
Yeah.
it up, but I can cut this. Yeah, here, stop recording. You see, what I have to do